Today's discussion will be presented in two sections, since we are recording the session for radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Feel free to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to get to them answered online. We are particularly pleased to welcome our moderator, Jason Fornicola, the Director of Custom Media for WTOP and Federal News Radio. Let me turn over the reins to Jason to begin today's discussion.
My guest today is Rick Howard, Chief Security Officer for Palo Alto Networks. Rick, great to see you.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the cyber attack chain. Tell me about the concept and where it came from.
Perfect. I love talking about this. It's kind of an evolution of our industry. When I started doing this back in the 90s, everybody had perimeter defense, okay, and that's how everybody did it, and that was the only thing we really had. And that's basically you put a bunch of security controls into your network and hope that the first one stops the bad guy from coming in. And if that doesn't work, maybe the second one will, and maybe the third one will. We've all been doing that for a very long time, and it just hasn't worked maybe in 15 years. In 2010, Lockheed Martin published a white paper, bunch of words in the title, Kill Chain, okay? And what this did is talked about a military concept about how you might defend yourself in the real world. And if you're an infantry platoon on top of a hill, and you're trying to prevent bad guys from coming up the hill, there's only a number of ways they can come up. So you would put obstacles in their place, right? And that would kind of start the kill chain. That's how you prevent the bad guys from coming up. These guys at Lockheed Martin said, what if we try to apply the kill chain model to cyberspace? And instead of trying to keep everything out, what if you assume that the bad guy is going to get in? And what do you do differently if you make that assumption, right? And they said, well, it turns out that every bad guy, regardless of what motivation they have, regardless of their cyber espionage, crime, terrorism, hacktivism, regardless of all those things, they all have to do generally about 6 things to be successful in accomplishing their mission. Right. So the first thing they have to do is recon a network, to find weaknesses in the defensive posture. Then they have to actually build a weapon system that can actually leverage those weaknesses they found. Then they have to deliver that system. Then they have to establish a beachhead, okay, on some endpoint somewhere. And that endpoint could be a laptop, it could be a server, it could be a copier, it could be anything that they can gain ground on. Once they've done that, they usually establish command and control out to the internet again to receive more instructions. That beachhead was just a way to get established. They reach back out, they get more instructions, and now finally, after they've done all of those things, then they can actually try to accomplish what their mission is, which is steal your credit cards or steal your state secrets or whatever that is. Once they collect all that stuff, then they have to exfiltrate that out into the world. So all those things I just talked about, those are phases of the attack lifecycle. That's how we call it at Palo Alto Networks. And what our systems do is prevent bad guys at each of those stages. And the good news for us is that we only have to be successful at one of those spaces. The bad guy has to be successful at every phase of the kill chain, or he has to stop what he's doing, regroup, and start over again. If we could stop them any place in that kill chain, in that life cycle, right, then we are preventing them from being successful in their mission.
When you look at best practices, how difficult is it for someone maybe with minimal training to go ahead and get access?
For like a hacker who's not very good yet, a kind of a beginner?
Sure.
It's easier than you think, all right, to have some success. Like they'll be able to have some success in the early stages of the attack life cycle, because there are kits out there that you can just download and use. Right? To be completely successful with a mission, though, that takes some skill. And because it takes a lot in persistence and being able to adapt as you run into roadblocks. So beginners have a hard time being completely successful executing every phase of the attack lifecycle. But beginners could have some success in the early stages.
So let's talk about this concept of fighting everyone rather than eliminating a known evil and some of the consequences of that.
What do you mean by that?
I'm thinking in the sense of if you're focusing all of your efforts on being right all the time, right, as opposed to narrowing down and, as you mentioned before, being able to fight off maybe one thing or one really important thing. Talk to me about that mindset.
Yeah, I think that's a great mistake in our industry, okay, because our whole philosophy has been to keep everything out. And maybe that's not as important. What I think is really important is to concentrate your efforts on what adversaries can cause material impact to your organization. And by material, I mean they cause a degradation of your bottom line if you're a commercial organization, or state secrets are stolen from you if you're a government organization, things that will hurt your organization. And concentrate on those kinds of attacks. Then you're better off in your protection of your own network. Because if you're worrying about some of this other stuff that has no material impact to your organization, that is wasting resources, and you need to redirect them back to the material impact stuff.
How frequently does that happen, that wasting of resources or not really focusing on the right things?
Well, I think in our industry, there's a lot of shiny objects in the cybersecurity space, and it's easy to get distracted with, well, I need this, and I need this. So what really needs to be happening with our network defender practitioners is doing a robust risk analysis of their own environment. What do they really need to be worried about, and what can they let go because it's not that big of a deal?
Does the lack of prevention and legacy approaches challenge claims that threats are evolving?
Well, I don't think it negates that, but what's happened is we've kind of lost interest in threat prevention because it's not sexy, right? When I started, all we had was threat prevention. You just could barely stop the bad guys. But somewhere in the 2000s, really interesting companies, innovative companies, came up with some fantastic technology that could detect adversaries once they were in your network. And we all bought them in spades. But somewhere around the 2010 timeframe, the security vendor community just kind of threw their hands up and said, it's so rampant that we can't prevent bad guys from getting in. We should all concentrate on detection and eradication. And that's just dumb, okay? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of, right? Because we can absolutely stop about 99% of the known threats out there, okay? Why would you leave that off the table? You still need to detect them once they're in, because you're not going to stop everything, and you need to get them off your network once they're in. But you need to prevent as much as you possibly can, right? And that's, even as the threats evolve, we're going to eventually figure out what they're doing. So let's prevent them as much as we can, and then do the other stuff also.
When you look at the 6 phases of the cyber attack life cycle, does one stand out to you more than another in terms of its importance or the weight that it carries?
Well, I don't know if it, yeah, I would say, because everybody concentrates on the endpoint. What goes on at the endpoint? And that is, bad guys have to deliver stuff to the endpoint, the bad guy has to establish command and control, and then they have to, once they've accomplished their mission gathering stuff that they want to steal, then they have to exfiltrate it off. So that's where everybody focuses. So the latter part of the attack life cycle is what causes the most damage. It's harder to pick up the earlier phases. The recon stuff, hard to pick up to know that some adversary that you're afraid of is actually reconning your network, all right? So most people focus on the bottom part of that.
If you've been breached, how long does it take you to figure that out, and how difficult is it to find out if it's a basic threat that did it, an advanced threat? Take me through that.
So there's a couple of questions there, right? I'm going to refer to the Verizon data breach report. That's the best data for this. Yeah. Typically, victims don't know that they've been attacked for at least 6 months to maybe even 18 months. And it's longer. They got evidence of other companies not even noticing. Yeah. The second thing that's bad about that is most people don't notice it themselves. They get told by outside organizations. So law enforcement calls them, or some anti-fraud company calls them and say, I think you got a problem here. So the average is about 2 years, I guess, is where I'm going. And what was the second question?
The second question was, how difficult is it to detect whether the breach was due to an advanced threat, a basic threat? How do you go about determining those things?
We're really bad at this in the industry, okay? And the way you should think about the problem is think about how the adversary has to attack you. They're going to come up with a playbook that they want to throw at a victim. Now, it's generic, right? And when they apply that playbook to a particular victim, we call that an attack campaign. What we can do is collect evidence as the bad guy comes down through the attack life cycle and put that into what we call indicators of compromise for an attack campaign. So if you see 10 of these things last week, and then you see 30 of them 3 days ago, and you see 50 of them yesterday, that's the bad guy walking his way down the attack life cycle. And if you know that, you see that up front, you can actually be proactive and say, we know that adversary is going for this target, and am I protected there? And so you run down there with your hair on fire to fix that, or you feel pretty good because they're not going to be able to achieve what they're coming there to achieve. Most of us can't do that. okay, because it takes a rethinking of how to think about protecting your environment. Most people just see alerts on one thing that the bad guy may leave behind in his wake, and they try to figure out if that's bad or not. It's just not possible to do. You need intelligence teams in your organization who can put that together for you, even if it's an intelligence team of one person or even a half person who does it part-time. So that they can say, hey, I know I've seen this is adversary X, they like to steal documents from our kinds of organizations, we should be worried about this particular one, and maybe not about this other one that's not going to affect us at all. Getting back to that preventing material impact idea.
You alluded to this earlier, but talk to me about the scope of the environment that we're in terms of big companies, financial consequences, branding consequences, government agencies, taxpayer data. Talk to me about what's on the line here.
I really think that we are on the verge of having this affect our way of life. We've got so accustomed to using the internet to manage ourselves, our communicating with our family and our friends and our loved ones, communicating with our business operations and all that kind of stuff. And what we're seeing is a 1,000 cuts, a death by 1,000 cuts. Right. We're not seeing this giant thing that we used to all think about 15 years ago. We're going to have the cyber Pearl Harbor. That's not what's happening. What we're seeing is a lot of little slices. That it's slowly eroding our confidence in the digital space. And if we get to the spot where we can't trust that environment anymore, then where are we as a society? So that's kind of where we are.
We have just a few seconds left, but in your mind, what do you see as the future of this issue?
I think that as a practitioner, okay, that we all have to get back to threat prevention, right? Put that back on the front as something we should all focus on.
I'd like to thank my guest, Rick Howard. He is the Chief Security Officer for Palo Alto Networks. You're listening to Disrupting the Cyber Attack Lifecycle, sponsored by Palo Alto Networks. I'm your host, Jason Fornicola, and you're listening to federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.